Okay, I want to thank everybody for attending this beautiful Wednesday afternoon session of Orion History 101. I think the trees are a little more interesting maybe than history right now. I found it so attractive driving over here this morning that I drove to the library instead of going to the Orion Center, but my car is used to doing that. So my name's Jeff Sutherland, and I'm a member of the Orion Historical Society. I'm the treasurer. Our chairperson is Sharon Kosniewski over there with all kinds of information and stuff over there. Our secretary is not here. Haven't seen Wendy. Our vice chairman is Marjorie Finley over there. If you would see a few other familiar faces here, so welcome to you all. I'm not a history expert. I don't study things that much. I found out as I started to put this together. I'm just kind of a regurgitator, so I just kind of try and take stuff in and let it out. So I was trying to figure out how to handle questions. So I think if we got questions, let's save them for the end, so we don't interrupt the beginning, and then those of you that have been bored too much can leave, and the rest of you can stay. So I have a couple of sources that I got most of my material from. One was this little paper, not little, it's pretty big, Orion since 1818, which was written by Paul M. Scott in 1976 for the bicentennial in the Orion Township Public Library sponsored the preparation of that. And the other one was this book, Images of Lake Orion, written by Jim Ingram and Laurie Grove. Jim Ingram was a historian and a regular contributor in the Orion Review of History, and Laurie Grove was also a bit of an Orion historian also. And then my third source of material was Mr. Google. And, that comes in pretty handy. I don't know how we survived without that beforehand. Hopefully most of you have the handout, which is two sides. It starts with prior to 1820 and ends up about 1910. So we're doing the first 100 years in that period, and we're going to be doing it in 30-year segments, and there's a whole lot of material to be covered. So I'll try to get us all through it without having any train wrecks on the way. So we'll start out with this map that's up here. This was an early AAA triptych that the Indians used to find Michigan. Actually, it was the French that made it to find Michigan. But looking back, obviously, the first occupants of this area, Michigan, not so much Orion and Orion Township, where there are Native Americans. There's not a whole lot of evidence of long-time settlements or anything like that actually here being in Lake Orion, but there is some evidence of historical burial grounds, Indian mounds they call them, out in the Bald Mountain Recreation Area, Green Shield and Kern Roads roughly. They think those might be 400 or more years old. It's kind of hard to go back and think, wow, 400 or 500 years, that's a long time ago. I was watching something on TV last night, and they were talking about, I think it was a cathedral somewhere, but it was built in 1500, you know, so we're just kids here. That's old time stuff. So also prominent findings or bits of history coming from the Native American friends are the Indian trails that were very prevalent, and the French found those, and there were several Indian trails. The most important one, and the one that affects mostly us, is the Saginaw Trail, which started here in Detroit and went up to Saginaw, but it passed through the Oakland County area. Basically, the route that they tell me that in Oakland County followed Woodward Avenue from Detroit to Pontiac, and then it kind of spread out from there, and Joslyn Road and Orion Road. They're kind of branches, smaller branches off of there, but those are those kind of neat roads to drive that go all around the lakes. And first early explorers in this area were primarily the French and the British. While the Spanish may have discovered America, we think, in 1492 with Columbus. So the French and the British obviously in the formation of the colonies and all of that story here, the formation of the United States with the independence in 1776, but the French and the British were a lot earlier than that. And that map that I showed you first, that was a 1763 map that the French had developed. There's some information there about the early French explorers explored Michigan area in the 1620s, claimed it in all the lands east of the Mississippi for France in 1668. When France was defeated in the French and Indian War in 1754 to 63, it ceded the territory to Britain in 1763. After the British defeat in the American Revolutionary War and the Treaty of Paris in 1783, kind of expanded U.S. boundaries, we'll see in a map of that in a minute, to include nearly all the land east of the Mississippi and south of Canada, including Michigan. Michigan was then part of the old Northwest Territory, they called it, from 1787 to 1800. Then it became part of the Northwest Territory when they made the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which kind of gave us a big piece of it. But the main Native American person that I think kind of stands out was Chief Pontiac, and that's one of the many pictures I saw of him, but you might recognize him for a hood ornament on your grandfather's Pontiac. That was him that was there. He was chief of the Ottawa Nation and fought with the French against the British and the American colonists in the French and Indian War. After the victory to the French forces, he reluctantly agreed to accept the presence of the British and the colonists, but only briefly. In 1763, he led the Ottawa and other Indian nations in what they call Pontiac's Rebellion. The Indians proceeded to capture all of the British forts in the area and sink some of their ships. And I didn't really know that before. The rebellion led to the death of about 400 British soldiers. The conflict ended due to the Indians having to resume hunting and go back to their fields. So the British had to send reinforcements across to get control of the region again. Chief Pontiac kind of accepted that in 1763, but then started the rebellion, and then the British were in control again, and it says the British were quite fearful of Pontiac and his warriors, and they hoped to establish peace with the tribe after the rebellion ended, but Chief Pontiac was killed in 1769 when a Peoria Indian clubbed Pontiac in the head, killing him. So I don't know if that was a bar fight or what that was, but that was the end of the illustrious career of Chief Pontiac. Going further into that time of the growing of the United States, the kind of pinkish area there is the original United States material property space after the Revolutionary War. See, Michigan is shaded in gray there. That Michigan was acquired from the French in a separate tree. And the gray areas were acquired from the French and Canadians. French and Canadians were the same at that point in time. Louisiana area in green was a Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and then Spanish Purchase took that. That red road is kind of the Lewis and Clark expedition and where that went. But the Michigan Territory itself, Louisiana Purchase in 1803, I think that was 800 square miles and was $15 million. So we can't pave a mile of road for that, I don't think, in Orion anymore. But that's
period.
yeah. Then we put a roundabout in. That's Michigan Territory was organized in 1805 from the Northwest Territory. The first sale of public lands in Oakland County occurs in 1818. So the U.S. government was auctioning off, actually not auctioning off, all they had to do was sign up. It was $2 an acre. The first purchase in Oakland County was purchased by a guy named Moses Allen out of New York, and he ultimately defaulted on the sale. But the agreement had terms that was to be paid in a reasonable time, and Moses didn't pay in a reasonable time, so he lost it. Oakland County was formally organized in 1819, and then there were only two townships, Oakland Township and Bloomfield Township. So Oakland was in the north area, Bloomfield was in the south area, and Orion Township here was part of the original Oakland Township. At that point in time, the population in Oakland County was 320 persons. It's kind of crowded. And that was the first Oakland County census. Among the first settlers were in the Decker settlement, which was at roughly at Kern Road and Gun Road, out in that area where Paint Creek runs through, and Clarkston and Kern Road and the one-lane bridge and that area. But three of the early settlers were Jesse Decker, Needham Hemingway, and Philip Bigler. And they built a mill, the three of them together as partners, in 1825. And Jesse Decker built a home and ran a what they called a public house, which is a tavern in 1825 talk. So that was really the early settlement, and we'll see that that kind of grows into the Lake Orion Village area. A lot of big land segments out in the old in the township area, original land grants, land purchases. There was also a small settlement out near Mill Lake, which would be Orion Road and, or not Orion Road, Baldwin and Clarkston Roads, where Mill Lake is out in there. And that was claimed by Judah Church and John Wetmore in 1819. So they were earlier than the first settlers in the Decker settlement, but that little settlement called Mohapek, an Indian word, really didn't survive. So it's the longest surviving settlement was the Decker settlement. There was also, we look at some maps that you've probably heard it mention of New Canandaigua, and having that as a name for Lake Orion. There was a fellow by the name of James Stilson who bought up a large part of the Orion, actually village area now. And he was a bit of a hustler and put out some fancy brochures and pictures and showing all sorts of wonderful things being in the land that he had planted in what will become the village of Lake Orion. But when people came out here, they bought it and all they saw was a swamp. So, but there was actually a community there. It was called New Canandaigua. It had its own post office at one point in time. But it did not survive and disappeared. Back in that point in time, the transportation event was that the Erie Canal was completed in 1825. So that meant that settlers trying to move in this area now could come out of generally the eastern states. A lot of New York and from Pennsylvania were coming in at that time, and they could get to Lake Erie through the Erie Canal. They still had to come across Lake Erie. It was a little bit scary, and into probably Detroit, and then made their way out to Orion and our area here. In terms of industry, Decker, Hemingway, and Bigler that we talked about before, they constructed a sawmill on Paint Creek. They dammed up Paint Creek and created a new large lake from 5 lakes that were above it. So there were 5 smaller lakes. They built a sawmill, and that dammed up the lake, but that isn't the lake kind of as we know it now. That mill burned down in 1832, and it was burned by the Indians because I think the story is that Jesse Decker and his public house would not give them any whiskey, so they burned down his mill. Yeah, it's good trade. Yep. Decker then bought out his 2 partners, had sole ownership of the mill, and that mill, the picture there is really a representation of what that second mill looked like. It was built a little closer to where we think the lake starts. Actually, the dam was pretty much where the dam is now, right there under M24. But that made the lake much bigger. There were also 2 grist mills for flour. So, these folks come out here, they got really not a whole lot to do. The drive-ins are closed, the TV doesn't work, there's no internet connection. So they had to kind of do the basic things, and that was, they had to have a sawmill to make lumber, had to have a grist mill to make flour, could eat and have a place to sleep with that. They had to clear the land and grow the grain for the grist mills, but they were in business at that point in time, and that is really the origin of the Lake Orion area. Orion Township was organized in 1835 with Jesse Decker, name again, you'll keep hearing that name, as its first supervisor. He was re-elected several times as a supervisor, served as state representative, kind of had his hands on all kind of things out in the township and in the village of Lake Orion, as we'll see. And Mr. Decker's salary as a supervisor was $2 a year. So. Along that same sort of time, Needham Hemingway, who was one of those original settlers in that Decker settlement, he put together a plat of land, platting property owned by Philip Bigler, one of the other partners, and filed the first plat in Oakland County in 1838, which was the basic original plat, and we'll look at that a little bit more in a minute, of the village of Lake Orion. But that was the first plat filed in Oakland Township, and when we look at that plat, we'll see a lot of familiar streets and signs. As far as education, the first school was built in the Decker settlement in 1827. The first school in the village was built in 1844 at the corner of Church and Anderson Streets, so that would be right next to the Union Church and where the police and the fire and the village offices are now. That original building is still there. There's a little, I'd call it a Dutch colonial house on the corner of Anderson and Church Streets, and that was the original school building, but that is now a residence. The first teacher in that school, I found this interesting, so I had to throw it in, was Mr. Dalby, and they tell me that he had no feet and he walked on his hands. So I'm not quite sure how that worked or how he did the chalk stuff that the teachers have to do, or the discipline, I don't know, but I just thought that was an interesting little item. As far as religion at that point in time, basically it was all circuit riders, mostly Methodists and Baptists back in the 1825-30 point review. Again, looking at population, again in 1820, Oakland County, you really can't split out the township population at this point. Oakland County is a total of 1820, we said 320. By 1830, it had grown to 4,911, and in 1840, up to 23,646 persons. But not very many of them were probably, I imagine if you counted the Decker settlement and the hands that were here, probably wouldn't go much more than 20 or 30 people in total. Yeah, a little bit more on the Decker settlement itself. The Decker settlement, the remnants of a mill pond dam and the pioneer graves in nearby Bigler Cemetery are the only evidence of the settlement that once occupied this site. Samuel Munson built a sawmill and a log cabin here in the spring of 1825. Jesse Decker, who gave his name to the settlement, arrived later that year with more settlers and established the first Euro-American community in Orion Township. By 1837, the Decker settlement had grown into a bustling commercial center with a sawmill, a tavern, a post office, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a school, and a cemetery. So things were moving along. Another mill that you might have heard about is Rudd's Mill as a community, being somewhat east of the village here. Powell Carpenter, and that's a pretty important name in Orion, particularly township history, built the mill in 1835 together with 3 dwellings, a store and a blacksmith shop, and a cooper shop, which I believe is a barrel making shop. Robert Rudd purchased the mill in 1865, and a small community became known as Rudd's Mill. In 1884, it was reported to have ground 70,000 to 80,000 pounds of wheat. So there's quite a bit going on there. The main house was destroyed later in 1904, and the mill ceased to operate in 1924. We'll move on to 1850 to 1880. It indicates above kind of a period of growth, a little bit of devastation and rebirth, and the start of the resort movement. In terms of communities, there were 2 plats of property, the Decker plat and then the Perrysburg plats were joined with a Hemingway plat to become the village of Lake Orion in 1859. This also is a mention of the new Canandaigua and the Paper City thing is merged into the village but later disappears. The village growth flourishes, and despite major fires in 1862, in 1874, that each time destroyed the downtown district. So there's just, at this point in time, there's just a complete repeat of the problem, the fire problem, the fire destruction. Obviously, the Civil War in 1861-65 has an effect on there. There's a Orion Union Guard that served as a distinguishing in there, but I'm not sure of how many members were involved in that. The big event transportation-wise was the arrival, and there it is, the Iron Horse coming into the Orion Depot. I can't tell you exactly what that is, but I think it might be a little later time than that. But it is an Iron Horse, and it's the Orion Depot. The train came in, it was arrived here in 1872 as a result of influence of an Orion area resident by the name of C.K. Carpenter, who was a director of the Bay City and Detroit Railroad and influenced the establishment and the running of the rails through Lake Orion area. A second railroad in 1880 comes in through the west side of the township. A map of 1872 that we'll look at a little bit shows a well-developed downtown district in the village. A road structure you will probably find familiar, and 2 railroad lines, and there's a list of businesses at that end of that we'll look at too. This is also the point in time when resorts started appearing as being a function in Detroit, or in Lake Orion. And largely, sensibly, it's because of the railroad coming through here, that now they had a way to get out of Detroit and into up north here. So in 1874, an Orion Park Association was formed. They purchased the park on the northeast shore of the lake, so kind of Greens Park, marina area on Lake Orion, on the north shore of the lake, and they offered cruisers out to the many islands into the lake. Construction also began on Park Island, and the resort area began. Excursionists, it said, came in large numbers in special trains from Detroit, and cottages started appearing on the shoreline of Lake Orion. Outside in the township, outside of the village, the dairy farms were probably the most prominent feature, but it was still pretty much a rural area. As far as religion, the Congregationalists built the first church in the village area in 1854. It was the Union Church, which is there on Church Street, again, where the village offices and administration is now. And that church was a shared church. That's why they called it Union Church. And it was shared for worship by the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Presbyterians, as well as the Congregationalists. And the Congregationalists assumed a $250 debt on the construction of the church, so they got first dibs of when to use the facility for worship. I'm not sure what time they chose, but a new Methodist church was built in the village in 1872. First newspaper was called Orion Good News. It has no connection yet to the Orion Review. This was largely a Methodist publication around 1872. It said it was published now and then. And its banner at the top of the newspaper said, "Religion, morality, prohibition, and home news." So that was what that was about. As far as education goes, by 1859, there were 9 school districts in Orion Township. Each had its own school board and its own schoolhouse, and their own budgets. And there's a telling of that point in time that they had their own school boards, they had their own elections, and they voted their own millage in each of those 9 separate districts all around, all within Orion Township. And generally the millage was voted for as long as it was needed. Just a really radical idea. So if they needed something done, they would levy millage for a year, they would do the project, and the millage would end. We don't see millage end anymore, but that's how it worked then. I think it would have been interesting to hear some of those budget hearings as they went on in those days. In terms now of population, we can start looking. I had trouble getting Orion Township population separate because it was different because of village being incorporated and pulling out of Oakland Township and segregating them. We must be able to track it all the way through. But by now, Oakland County is up to 41,527 people. Village of Lake Orion's about 429, and that was in the 1880 census. And probably the total township might have had 1,500 people in it. Now this is the village area itself. You can see that block area right in there is the village of Lake Orion. This is the Canandaigua Plat, which is later merged into Lake Orion. You can see the lake is even called Canandaigua Lake. But that all got changed to being Orion. All right, we're at 1880 to 1910. This again is a period where we had more growth, we had more fires, and some more progress, but things started to liven up at that point in time. Reverend Gilbert Squires, a Methodist pastor, bought Park Island, Assembly Island, and established what was called the Methodist Assembly Grounds in 1897. Had quite a bit of success with that. Had gatherings on Assembly Island, as it was called then, that were called Chautauqua, which were basically campground assemblies, religious assemblies that would last a period of time. Shortly after the Methodists acquired it, they sold it to a fellow named John Winter. It says John Winter's there, but it was John Winter, and you'll hear a lot about John Winter in the coming periods that are coming up there. He was a real mover and shaker in terms of making things happen. John Winters and others organized the Assembly Resort Association and bought Bellevue Island, built a bridge and road, and an auditorium for 2,250 people. People were flocking to these Chautauqua assemblies that were, again, like camp meetings and religious and spiritualist gatherings. In 1901, the city of Orion, the double-decker boat, is launched with a dance floor and live bands. So stuff was happening. In terms of transportation, here in Orion, the big deal was the interurban was established in 1900, which was the trolley. We'll have a picture of that in a minute. System which linked all of southeast Michigan together. So you could go from Detroit to Lake Orion, up to Oxford, over to Romeo. Quite amazing that mass transit was so good back then and so absent now, but that's progress, I guess. A little bit on that side too about the winds of change are coming. Several things there. Pontiac had really a bustling buggy business and industry grow in Pontiac. One of the more notable ones was the Pontiac Buggy Company, established in 1893 by a guy named Edward Murphy. He then renamed that as they were starting to see motor cars, and we'll talk about that along with this too, as the Pontiac Motor Car Company in 1907. That quickly changed the name to be the Oakland Motor Car Company. In 1909, a fellow by the name of William Durant merged that with a company that he was created, a new company called General Motors Company, which had just a small influence on Oakland County in Michigan as it grew. You obviously had, if you looked at the history of the automobile, it kind of goes back to actually as early as the 1830s. I think you would find things here and in Europe for motor-powered vehicles. But it was really not until the 1900s, early 1900s, that the auto really started becoming a factor in mass transportation. In 1906, Henry Ford had set up his assemblies line to assemble the Model Ts in Highland Park. So that's really bringing a big change in terms of what was happening in Lake Orion between the train and later on really for the automobile. But that was clearly starting out in that area. terms of fires, in 1894, the South Broadway and East Side area of the village burns, and they formed a fire company. The Emmons grist mill, which was further a little bit downstream on Paint Creek, burned. John Winter again and a doctor named Dr. Law, they buy the mill and develop a small lighting plant, which becomes Orion Power and Light, which lighted, I think, street lighting, basically, not really residential at that point in the village area. The Methodist Church, we mentioned that it built the church in 1872. The site of that first church was about where the AutoZone store is now in downtown Lake Orion. With the number of fires they had, and that increased as the trains started coming through, they were afraid of the church catching fire, so they moved the church about 2 blocks east to where it is now. There are people in our church. I go to that church, the Hawkswell family. They've been here a long time, but they'll tell stories about their grandfathers assisting in moving the church from where it was, which would have been on the corner of 24, 2 blocks east to where it is now, rolling it on logs. So it's still there, though, and growing, but not as fast as we'd like. Later on, in 1902, the west side of Broadway burned, so the other side of the street. And then in 1910, again, the east side burned. So fire was a very dangerous and a feared thing in those times. In terms of other things happening in that period of time, Verwood building, Verwood Hotel, apartments now downtown, was built in 1880 and was built for a cataract house, so I think it's for eye care. Brick schoolhouse was built on the Elizabeth Street site, which isn't the school that's there now, but that's been a site for a school for all that time. So they built a brick schoolhouse there in 1883. The Bell Company initiated phone service. 1890, they started building the Bellevue Hotel on Bellevue Island. That was done in 2 phases. So the first phase was started in 1890. The second one will be in our next segment. In 1896, the Orion State Bank was established. It had a office on East Flint, west of where the stoplight is on Broadway now. And that bank was established by Carpenter, C.K. Carpenter, who we talked to earlier, who was a big farmer and developer in the area. Predmore, the Predmore name is kind of prominent in there. The old Predmore house is on South Broadway right now, right before you get to Elizabeth Street. And in 1905, our first marine mail delivery was done. It was the first marine delivery service in the whole country. Was here in Lake Orion, delivering mail to the houses along the shore. There were many successful large farms. The Carpenter family had a general store, which was reported doing good business, located on their farm on Silver Bell Road. The Orion Weekly Review, now the Orion Review, started publishing in 1881. A downtown scene, population, at this point in time, Oakland County, 44,792. Orion Township, 751. Village of Lake Orion, 522. That was the 1910 census. That's a little fuzzy, but downtown Lake Orion, about 1900. Some of this you can still see being there. The white home there, that was originally a doctor's home, but that is still in existence, and I think...
Arts Pizza.
Pardon?
It looks like Arts Pizza. Well, it used to be Arts back in the 50s.
Way back, yep. That's a little bit beyond this point in time yet, though. Pizza is too. Okay, here, this is the ice business. And this is an ice house. And they would go out in the lake and cut the blocks of ice. And you have to ask, well, how do they keep that stuff cold long enough to sell it? So they're cutting it out of the lake. This is on the lake, cutting blocks of ice. And they were hauled by horseback into ice houses where they stored the blocks of ice, and they stored it with either packed hay or sawdust all around the inside of those buildings. And part of the story is that some of the Lake Orion lumber buildings were originally ice houses. And then from the ice houses, they would load them up onto, this isn't particularly an Orion one, but delivering ice primarily to Detroit. So I got that information from Marjorie Finley, our most chairman, but I think it's an interesting aspect that employed a lot of people. It was a real boost to the economy at that point in the 1900s, and she gave me quite a bit of information on that, and she's going to have to do a bigger story on that. Okay, then we're getting into 1910 to 1920 as we get closer to the end of our journey. Again, that's, more progress, more resorters. Again, winds of war starting. In terms of the resorters, John Winter, our guy that keeps showing up, established Lake Orion Summer Homes Company. He bought Park Island, created an amusement center with rides, including a roller coaster, games, and a dance hall in 1911. So the islands and the travel and that stuff started as religious camp assembly type things, the Chautauqua things, getting people into Lake Orion, coming to Lake Orion, basically coming mostly by train at that point in time, earlier to this. He also bought the Assembly Resort properties, which amounted to Bellevue Island and most of the lakeshore properties around the lake, the dance hall, and started selling cottages for prices more affordable for many. So a lot of the small cottages dotting around the lake and around the Orion area were summer homes built by John Winter's company, Lake Orion Summer Homes. They were mostly resort cottages. They report that excellent boat service was still available to all the islands. This is the main landing. This would be in Greens Park. For going over to Park Island and the Park Island Amusement Park. Probably seen that many times. That building in the background there, I think, is terminal for the interurban railway, so they could really haul the people in. That started, we said, in 1900, so that would get the people in there. They'd get on a boat, and this is where they'd land on Park Island, the amusement park. That's a shot of one of the boats loading. I guess that's leaving from Park Island, going back to the mainland, I guess is the right way to call that. This is another view from into Park Island, looking down at the dock in that loading area that we showed coming in. You may notice we're getting a lot more photographs now than you got earlier. That they didn't have cameras till about 1884 that could reproduce pictures easily on paper. So I think Kodak started in like 1884. So now we're starting to see a lot more of what was really there. This is Park Island also, and it was amusement parks, eating places, gaming. I think probably about any hustle you could imagine could be found there. That's a swimming dock, but I think this is back on, not on the island, but along Flint Street or Lake Shore, out in that area. But there were a lot of people coming here. That's the entrance onto the rolling coaster that was called the Thriller. That's the downtown scene in, I think it was 1907. But, you know, that building right there you're looking at is Ed's costumes and all that stuff. And then further down would be where Sagebrush is now, but of course that building burned. The newer structure there, but the bigger three-story structure at the end, that's the hotel, the Vermont Hotel. So Griggs Drug Store is one of those businesses there. This is a shoreline scene of basically about Greens Park area. Looking around the cove, if you're looking out that way, it would be Orion Marine, and those boathouses are going along Flint Street. And those two chimneys sticking up there is my house. That's where I live. So, but I don't remember these days. Again, this picture on the top, you may have seen this, is one of my favorites. But this is a picture that John Winter used on his brochures and advertising for resorters to come to Lake Orion. And they had a couple different captions on them, and the Historical Society sold caps at them, but this one says, the most attractive and healthful resort of its kind in the Middle West, beautiful Lake Orion, easily reached via electric, steam, and good automobile roads from all points. There's another one of those photographs, same photographs, but it has a caption on it that says, "A clean place for clean people." So that they're referring to us, I think. And then the other side of it said, "Parking for 1,000 automobiles." That's not quite the parking situation we have in the village right now. But the resort cycle was just in full process at that point in time. In terms of transportation, Lapeer Road became a trunk line in 1916, and it was graveled and headed up towards Lapeer as it does now. But it was almost impassable in the winter. There's some pictures showing just awful situations stuck in the mud. Broadway was paved in 1919. Streets had a little bit of different names to them. And Broadway was in a different position. Broadway was actually where Anderson Street is now. And where Broadway is now was called Market Street. And the other side of the Methodist Church, which is Slater Street now, was called Hemingway Street. There were two train stations in the village serving the Michigan Central and the DUR lines, the trolley lines. And then the Grand Trunks lines were served in the township in the west, and there were two what they call flag stations along that route that if you had something, either a passenger or material to be hauled by the train, you put the flag up, the train stopped, they loaded you or your material, and away it went on its way. Fires, again, in 1910, most of the east side of Broadway was leveled by fire, and the Orion Township Fire Department was organized, and its first chief was named George Cole. Other things going on at that point in time was Detroit Edison bought the Orion Light and Power Company that Jesse Decker and Philip Bigler had established back in the, I think, 1839. and we started having a larger electrical service and connections and moving into residences. In 1913, the first movie was shown in the Lincoln Theater on South Broadway. In 1950, water lines and a village well are installed. And the Decoux Cancer Center is opened on East Flint Street in 1889 on the site where the PNC Bank is now. So, also at that time, winds of war blowing again. The Lusitania is sunk in 1915, leading to the U.S. Entry into World War I. Or the Lusitania was sunk in 1915, and we entered the war in 1918. At that point in time, the township has 90,050 people. The township has 657, and the village of Lake Orion has 929. And that's based on the 1920 census. And that's the end of our journey of the first 100 years. I thought we were going to do 200 years when I started on this, but it was way too much that either the mind or the seat could endure. As far as my reading of this and going through this thing, probably the three key people in the history of Orion Township would have been Jesse Decker for establishing the Decker settlement and the mills and the dam that made Lake Orion, and then the platting of the actual village area itself. Probably in the middle area, I would say the C.K. Carpenter, who was influential in getting the railroad to run through the township, probably was a big item because the train line was the big thing that made Orion become a place on the map at that point in time. And obviously the last guy I think would be John Winter, that having the ability to look at the situation and say, okay, here's something we can really get going here, and establishing the Orion Summer Homes Company and all of the houses and the amusement park and all that went on in Lake Orion. I know, I think my parents were born in 1921, but I can remember them talking about coming over to dance over in Lake Orion. So maybe when we get to the next section of this, which there will be a follow-up for the second 100 years done sometime next year. And I hope you'll have an interest and will join us. So.